So I'm going to present something I've been working on for the last 16 years. It's going to be rather rushed to fit that into 10 minutes, but I'll have a go. And I'm hoping to kind of illustrate some indications of the difference between if you apply a conventional approach to a real-world problem compared with what I would call a Gaian or a systems approach. So the problem is a population of elephants in central Mali. And in 2003, I was asked to try and understand why this elephant population had survived, while all the other elephant populations all around and on this latitude had disappeared. Understand their migration, were they threatened, or what needed to be done about it? So this is where we are. This brown squiggle shows the elephant migration route, and they make this huge, the longest annual migration in the world of all elephants. This area covers a whole range of habitats, right from dunes and plains in the north, down to kind of more wooded savannas in the south. There's few little water holes surrounded by thicket forest. And there's also great diversity of ethnicities who all have different lifestyles and livelihoods. So if we're zooming in a bit here, these are the tracks of some individual elephants to show the migration route. They do this kind of counterclockwise migration. On a satellite image, we see the sand deserts up here, Timbuktu, the river here. This is an escarpment. And there's a gradient of rainfall from about 150 millimeters in the north to 450 in the south. And to give you an idea of the scale, we're talking about an area about twice the size of Wales. And the first thing that you can see is that there's areas where they spend lots of time, and they obviously like, and there's areas where they dash across very rapidly and they don't like. And that's the clue to kind of understand what's going on here. And very rapidly, you can see that in the dry season, they're spending time in the north. If you look at this kind of area, and this is what it looks like. So they're spending their time around these waterholes, and as they dry up, they move on to another waterhole. And eventually, they all end up at a last waterhole that holds water all the year round. So this is an absolutely crucial point for them. And they stay there until it rains. And then they travel south very rapidly. And in the south, they have better food, but there's no water all the year round, so they can only stay there while it's raining. The other thing about the south is that it's full of people. So that's the picture of the key waterhole. So it's waterholes surrounded by forest. So you can see there's just these pockets of forest. Coming down to the south, you see that's actually quite a well-defined area there. And if we zoom in there, we see that they're just using one path between these hills. And if you plot the villages, then you see why. You also see that they're not ranging around here. And when you go down and ask what's happening here, you find that the chief of this village is a very powerful chief, and he's a pastoralist, and he's managed to stop agriculturalists from clearing this area. And so this has provided a haven for elephants. That's what that pass looks like from the air. And you find that all these areas have similar little stories about the human-environment-elephant relationship. And at the end of 3 years, I discovered, it seemed to me that this migration route, it was suffering from a gradual squeeze, incremental change and degradation and human activity in all kinds of ways throughout the elephant range was threatening to cut it off. And not only that, but events at one part of the migration, so if you're cutting down something at one, it ramifies all the way through the elephant range, and so it's a kind of a connected system. And the urgent action was required at that lake because it was drying sooner and sooner each year. But what could you do? I felt we had about 5 years to start trying to do something. The people who employed me wanted to set up a protected area around that lake. That was the conventional solution. People were seen as the problem, therefore you had a protected area that eliminated people. But from my perspective, I knew that this whole elephant range, this migration route was connected. If you did that, you might solve a problem for a little while, but it would eventually, all the other factors would be continuing and would come back to bite you in an even more difficult way to do something about. And as it turns out, fortunately, I also felt that all the factors are pushing in one direction. If you try to fight them, cut the problem out and fight them, you're going to need an awful lot of resources, of time and people's energy, and that just wasn't there. And so maybe, how about trying a Gaian approach, where you saw the problem of elephants as emerging out as an emergent property of this context of relationships between elephants, people, and the environment, and that maybe, just maybe, you could identify places and people and attitudes or beliefs that you could reinforce, join up, and just try and make that context a little bit more conducive to elephant survival. But what to do? I'm a conservation scientist. I felt obviously I needed to understand this relationship with people a lot better. I needed the help of a sociologist. This is who's become my colleague and chief of operations on the ground. And so, somewhat with heart in mouth, we convened these community meetings to ask people what did they feel about elephants and how did they fit into their lives. And the first thing that they said was that no, if elephants disappear, it means the environment's no longer good for us. So we don't want to see the end of elephants. That was the number one key. I thought, we've got something here. The second thing was that they very well understood the problems that were happening, the problems of environmental degradation, and each ethnicity had its systems to manage that, but they wouldn't respect the ethnicities, the rules of other ethnicities. So, for example, you'd have people cutting trees. They knew it wasn't a good idea, but if they felt that if they didn't do it, that Fulani over there would cut it down, so they wanted to get the benefit now. So that was the kind of key number two. But then very soon we had a problem at this lake. It was going to dry prematurely and the elephants would not be able to survive, so we had to do something. But I had absolutely no idea what you could do about that. These seemed like a huge problem. What on earth can you do about this? It's overrun with cattle. So this is my colleague here, the sociologist. We did a study of all the people living around this lake, and we got a shock, because we had assumed that the increasing numbers of cattle, increasing numbers of people around this lake were correlated, directly correlated. But actually, over 96% of the cattle using that lake didn't belong to the local people. They belonged to wealthy urban populations, commercial herd owners, who was hiring impoverished herders and sending them out into wilder places to find pasture. So the problem was actually quite different to what we had assumed with a kind of a conservation scientist approach. There was also lots of other impacts of the urban centres, hundreds of kilometres away on this area. So that was the key number three. We brought all the clans and ethnicities together to present our findings, and they very soon unified around a common perception of their problem. And once they said that, well, what we need is systems that everybody respects. So they immediately set up a representative these are traditional systems that they used, so kind of traditional technology, if you like. A management committee that was representative of the social groupings, teams of young men who would patrol to ensure that the rules set by the management committee were respected. And they set aside an area of reserve pasture, which they protected with fire breaks so that they would always have pasture at the end of the dry season. They also protected, had rules surrounding the lake. These are the young eco-guards building the fire breaks. And they found that, and there was a big fire that year. They were able to sell hay. They were able to sell forest products from their forests that they had protected. They were also able to control the cattle herds by charging per head for access to these resources of pasture and water. And they were able to do that because Mali has decentralisation legislation which puts natural resources in the hands of local communities. So that's a kind of a top-down, firm impact on what's happening. Everything was going really well. All the other communities said, please help us do the same thing. But in 2012, there was a coup, an insurgent, a rebellion, separatist rebellion, and opportunist insurgency all at once. The elephant range the government fled, and it became lawless almost overnight, full of weapons. And we had poaching. Elephants started being poached for the first time. This was a small population, only about 500 elephants. So it was an enormous problem, completely lawless. but the local community, their leaders, said, well, we will make edicts that anybody who kills elephants is branded as a thief. And that carried great disgrace locally. And we also established a vigilance network. So these young men who were watching out for poaching, letting us know, and they would discover they could discover through their networks who the perpetrators were. We were only able to give them kind of recognition payments in terms of food, but none of them joined the jihadist groups, even though they were offering between $30 and $50 a day, because this carried so local status. They were doing something of benefit to the wider community, and it was safer. So they managed to contain poaching for about 3 years, but then in 2015 there was a big decrease in security, many more attacks, and it was clear that we needed to have some kind of enforcement unit that could make arrests. But creating that and finding the right trainers, because the approach that the trainers took is absolutely key. And generally, my criteria was, we can't have a generic approach that is imposed from outside. It's got to be something that is adapted to that local context, and it has to be something that supports the people. And I sought many trainers and eventually found Chengeta Wildlife, and they said, this is key. Anti-poaching can't work unless it's adapted to the local environment, and we need that information, and part of getting that information is, being engaged with the local population. As soon as they became fully operational, poaching just stopped in February 2017. And the reason it stopped is that this funny little anti-poaching unit were able to do something that all the foreign militaries and the UN were not able to do. At that time, they were staying in their bases. It was deemed too dangerous to go into these zones. This unit was zipping around and popping up everywhere and making it their mission to turn up in some of the hottest areas and moving on. And it's all because of their approach that was adapted to the local environment, the local context. So, very briefly, we started trying to conserve and give the elephants a future and to coexist peacefully with humans. And we ended up actually helping poverty, making more resources available, turning back some of the environmental degradation. It ended up, which was a real surprise to me, it ended up improving social cohesions because these social groupings had to come together to realize those benefits. And it also had an impact on preventing the radicalization because it was preventing those young men from joining up and being jihadists, and we found that has continued. We've got other evidence on that. And there were even lessons for how the security and stability actors would help in trying to deal with an insurgency. So how did a Gaian approach help? I think that perspective shift of seeing a problem as emerging out of a context enabled you to identify areas where you could intervene and actually make some kind of difference. And it's that recognition that larger scale phenomena arise from local relationships. And that somehow has allowed to do something about what seem very huge tasks like poverty and radicalization and these kind of things. And the continual recognition that you're always coming from one perspective. I'm always coming from the perspective that I'm sort of trained in, and therefore there's an awful lot you don't know, and then you're having to bring in people who can complement, from other disciplines because you're dealing with everything. And what you find is that can unify diverse perspectives. So when looking at this system, the political ecologists will be saying, but the problem is the corruption in the government. That's what you've got to do. And the conservation scientists say, the problem is people. You just get people out of the way and, you'll conserve the environment. And then you've got some sociologists saying, well, it can't be the people that are the problem because they have systems of resource management. But generally, the sociologists are just studying one ethnicity. So it's a way of kind of bringing together all the different perspectives to try and make something else emerge, put it that way. And if we're looking at kind of more general principles, I thought it'd be appropriate to end with a feedback loop. That this kind of 16 years journey has been a continual seeking to try and to understand that perspective shift of us as within, as phenomena emerging out of a set of relationships and us as embedded within it, instead of as trying to manage it, you know, kind of above it and trying to manage something. And that sort of, and it seems that if there's a general principle, is kind of make the choices that nurture life, and not life just in terms of quantity, but in terms of the processes of life and the qualities, what is appropriate and what is valuable where. And for in the more social world, that tends to be something like fostering community and cultivating connection, but then that's also with the natural world as well. So recognizing those relationships, and then seeking to embed those human systems in those of nature. It's always quite striking that a lot of the things that we use fossil fuel technology for, nature could do for free if we just designed things better. And then that, seeking that, kind of informs again the perspective shift. So you start off and see how the system, if you like, responds, and then that directs the next act. So just to say thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that wonderful example of Gaia 2.0, Susan. I'm trying to interpret my own clock here, but I think it's overrun. We could have one quick question. If there's John, I'll let you ask a quick question. That was great.
Susan, what a stunning story. I mean, congratulations. But politics get a bit sticky when people start to get killed, and your special unit zipping around and popping up in hotspots unexpectedly. Have you had deaths on either side, and how were those dealt with?
No, we haven't, actually. They suffered a huge ambush. I don't know if any of you heard about, well, you might have heard about the 4 US special forces that were killed in Niger by a big ambush, very well-trained ISIS ambush. They also suffered an ambush from the same people, but they got 2 wounded, and I think they dispatched quite a few of the other side because they had this adaptive training. I mean, I can go into the, you know, exactly what that means, but it's basically the leader of this training outfit. He comes from a game ranger background. So he's using the kind of skills that, you know, hunters to understand the bush. You know, so the first thing they do is try and understand what the behavior is of people and the issues, and then you adapt it accordingly. So you're sort of informing yourself about the context. So they were popping up in these areas and moving on. They knew they would be followed, so they double back and then ambush the people who are following them, you know, in terms of, and just, you know, letting them go, obviously. But it's always a risk, though. I mean, it's always a huge risk, and it is, yes, very, very tough. But you always have to make it in people's, so for Chengeta wildlife, it has to be their responsibility, and they're very keen to operate in this area to demonstrate the effectiveness of their approach.
Let's thank Susan again for brilliant work.